So welcome everyone to our first Scholars in the Square lecture for this semester. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown and I'm the Director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at UVic. As a reminder, especially after a holiday break where I'm sure we all forgot how the university works, our SITS format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, Dr. Todd Klaiman, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then he will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Dr. Megan Swift, Associate Professor of Russian Studies at UVic. Megan specializes in the culture of Lenin and Stalin's Russia and has worked on 20th century Russian literature, culture, and art, and Russian revolutionary culture. She is currently the CSRS Faculty Fellow and is working on a project on religious pluralism in Putin's Russia, the resurgence of indigenous religious ceremonies and festivals in the Russian Federation today. After Todd and Megan talk for 20 minutes, I'll then chair a 20-minute open discussion period. So our speaker for this evening is our very own Program and Research Coordinator at the Center, Dr. Todd Klaiman. He is also a faculty member in the Asian Studies departments at Langara College and Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Todd is a former Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Dissertation Fellow in Buddhist Studies and completed his PhD in Chinese history at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 2021. Todd's research explores religion and migration, specifically how movements of people, goods, ideas, practices, and symbols impact boundaries, belonging, and identity formation in China and Southeast Asia. Now, before I turn the podium over to Todd and Megan, I would like to just point out the beauty of thinking about how there is probably no other place in the world other than the CSRS where a rich scholarly conversation between a scholar of Chinese Buddhism and a scholar of Russian literature and culture could happen. But I think you will see why this is a brilliant match. Now, as I was reflecting on the land acknowledgement for this evening and the ways I might think about how I can relate beauty pageants, Buddhist relics, and the Cold War to ideas of indigenous sovereignty, reconciliation, and renewal, I reflected on the ways that communities and cultures often get caught up in and face serious threats to their own sovereignty when resident on the lands that are the focus of the struggle between superpowers, and the inevitable impact these struggles might have on the material culture, rituals, and the lives of these communities. And so I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, Wissepsim, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Todd.
Thanks, Rachel. So as some of you may know, my research interest described broadly looks at Chinese religions, primarily Buddhism and Taoism, and their intersection with commerce, migration, and politics in Chinese society during the late imperial and modern period, with a particular focus on East and Southeast Asia. My recent research considers how Chinese Buddhism engaged with domestic and international politics to confront changing geopolitical realities during the Cold War era. And my approach to this topic treats the involved parties as stakeholders. This means stakeholders who employ diverse strategies to balance their own interests with the interests of other stakeholders in these interactions. For example, local stakeholders, foreign stakeholders, religious stakeholders, political stakeholders, and so on. So tonight, I'll focus on three distinct bodies that I consider to be sites of intersection for interests of various stakeholders involved in what I'm calling Buddhist cultural diplomacy in East and Southeast Asia during the 1960s. And as we go, you'll see what I mean by three distinct bodies, hopefully. All right, so first let me set the context in which these stakeholders interacted, beginning with the Chinese side. With the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, which replaced millennia of imperial rule with an internationally recognized parliamentary republic governed by the Nationalist Party, the Chinese Nationalist Party, or I'll refer to it going forward as the KMT. So you can see on the map on the screen there, this sort of brownish area, this is the territory controlled by the Republic of China. By 1912, but within a decade of the new republic being formed, it encountered serious problems, and the ruling nationalist or KMT party found itself competing with the newly founded Chinese Communist Party, established in 1921, for the control of the nation. And you can see here on the bottom right-hand side, this competition resulted eventually in outright civil war, which ended in 1949 and resulted in the Nationalist Party, represented here with the flag of the Republic of China, fleeing to the island of Taiwan. But as this propaganda poster from the 1960s, even if you don't read Chinese, don't be frightened. These propaganda posters were often, they were designed for a mostly illiterate population to understand, so you should be able to understand it as well. I'll leave that dangling. So you can see here in 1960s, this is a Republic of China propaganda poster demonstrating that the KMT had to retreat after losing the civil war to the Chinese Communist Party, but also demonstrating the vision of eventually retaking the mainland and liberating these comrades or these compatriots from under the supposedly oppressive communist regime. And the other side of this civil war and the result of the 1949 defeat of the Republic of China, and its reformation on Taiwan is the communist side. So the victors, the Chinese Communist Party, here's a propaganda poster sort of demonstrating the vision that they had following their victory in the Civil War. And so they established, Mao Zedong, 1949, October 10th, established the People's Republic of China. Okay, so we now have the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China here with this vision that you see in this propaganda poster. Again, without even reading the Chinese, you can see the vision is that the Communist Party is responsible for protecting the mainland from, and now it helps to read the Chinese a little bit, from the imperial ideology, imperial expansionism of the Americans, which is supporting, and you can see the American battleship here with a Japanese flag flying on it and a Japanese general. So the imperial expansion ideology of the Americans supporting Japanese, and down here, Chiang Kai-shek drowning he's the leader of the KMT on Taiwan, with the Republic of China flag in tatters on the beachfront here. So with the Americans and their imperialist expansion ideology supporting the Japanese and the nationalists, the Chinese nationalists, in their efforts to occupy, as the words in Chinese here describe, the mainland. So the Communist Party sees itself as the defender in this case. And in the top right-hand corner, we see a propaganda poster from the US. It's actually a poster encouraging Americans to send aid to support the war effort of the nationalists against the Communist Party. And I can't see it, I don't have my glasses on, but I know there's a line in here, I think I'm somewhere near it right now, that says something about supporting the Chinese in their quest to establish democracy. So that's the key piece here, this idea of democracy. That's partly why the Americans are interested in supporting the nationalist government. All right, so moving on to the second piece of contextual information I'd like to supply you with, and that relates to Vietnam, which is what we now call Vietnam, which is sort of another site of this intersection between religion and politics that I'm going to talk about. And you can see here, I had originally started with a bunch of slides starting from the early 1800s here, but then Scott reminded me that it's only a 20-minute talk. So anyone interested in the background of all of this, you're welcome to ask a question about, okay, how did we get to where we were in 1956, which is with the Americans in the South basically introducing puppet presidents to rule the Republic of Vietnam in the South, presidents that they could guarantee were anti-communist and loyal to the American cause in the South. And they do this in opposition to Ho Chi Minh and his Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the North, which with his sort of support of his communist regime in conflict with the South, going back and forth, trying to decide who will unite the nation and rule the newly united nation. And here on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a comic book cover from the 1960s in the US, published actually by a Christian publishing house in, I think, somewhere on the east coast of the US. And this sort of gives you quite a clear representation of why the Americans, primarily why they were interested in maintaining their control over the South by placing these puppet presidents in control of the Republic of Vietnam. And that is because they were concerned, particularly since about 1949, with the rising influence of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism across Asia and Eastern Europe. And the reason 1949 is a turning point is because, as I said on the last slide, that's when the Communist Party in China establishes the Republic of China. And then in 1953, the Korean War ends in a stalemate with the communists controlling the northern portion of the peninsula. So the Americans were concerned about the spread of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union. The other piece of this, or the other side of this Cold War détente, is here on the right-hand side of this image, which shows the Chinese Communist Party here labeled on the flag with the stars, and then on the other side, the Soviet Union. And this image is a propaganda poster that demonstrates the cooperation and the collaborative effort between the early cooperation and the early collaborative effort between the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union in their effort, and this is what's written at the bottom here, their effort to resist the imperialist expansionism of the West, represented, if you have good eyes, you can see tiny little disheveled British and American soldiers here representing dwarfed against this collaboration between these two Soviet states, these two socialist states. And so not only resisting that imperialism, expansionism, but then in the background, you see all the lovely pink clouds and white birds flying over the global working class that the Chinese communists and the Russians imagined themselves bringing peace to and protection to. So that's all there in that particular poster. And that's what I want to give you for historical contextualization. So now we can get into what was going on with the Buddhists. And so against this politically charged and bifurcated background of the Cold War, Buddhists across Asia sought to develop a unified modern presence. They also wanted to participate in these political activities, or at least be represented, especially since many new nations were starting to develop, independent nations at this time. They wanted a say in that. And so they did this by establishing Pan-Asian organizations, Buddhist organizations. These include, but are not limited to, the World Fellowship of Buddhists, which was established in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, in 1950. This was a primarily Theravadan Buddhist organization, which is the dominant form of Buddhism in Southeast Asia. And then alongside that Theravadan organization is the Mahayana organization, which is the sort of representative of East Asian Buddhism. Again, if you want to know more about that, we can talk about it after the presentation. And that is represented by the Republic of China, so Taiwan, and the KMT, the Nationalist Party, and the Buddhists who fled, many of them, from the mainland during and before the end of the Civil War. And that's the World Chinese Buddhist Sangha Council. And this is an organization that was established in 1965 and had its first international conference in 1965 in Taipei, the capital of the Republic of China. And it's important to note that this is a collaboration between the nationalist government and the Buddhists on Taiwan. So the organization and this first meeting had a fairly obvious political agenda. And that political agenda can be seen in a couple of examples. First of all, it was an international meeting. So the Buddhists in Taiwan were supported financially by the nationalist government to go across Southeast Asia and invite prominent representatives of Chinese Buddhism. Okay, so I'm putting that in air quotes. If you want, we should probably talk at some point about what that means. I don't have time right now, but you're welcome to ask about it. Okay, so they were going across Southeast Asia looking for Chinese Buddhists, especially prominent figures, like the one on the bottom left-hand corner here, being welcomed at the Taipei airport. Actually, it's the Songshan airport. So yeah, in downtown Taipei now. And this is Thich Tam Chau. He is a representative of the moderate branch of Buddhists in South Vietnam. So there was a moderate branch, and there was more of a sort of revolutionary branch. He was a moderate representative here, and so was invited. And as I say, the overt political aim of this organization and this meeting can be seen, first of all, in this press conference here at the top, in which this monk's name is Bai Sheng, and he is one of the organizers from Taiwan, and he writes in his diary that his main aim for going to South Vietnam and inviting Thich Tam Chau to the meeting is to have him publicly express his support, or publicly express his anti-communist position and his pro-Republic of China position, and then his pro-US position. So we find out later in Bai Sheng's diary that that's not entirely true or an accurate representation of this monk's position. Again, we can talk a little bit more about that later if you're interested. But for the sake of perhaps harmony and also the meeting, Thich Tam Chau does hold a press conference and proclaims his support for the Republic of China. Remember, this is in their agenda of pushing back against the People's Republic of China. So he's supporting the Republic of China on Taiwan. So that's one example of this overtly political agenda in this meeting. The other example is the quote here from one of the high-ranking KMT officials who were asked to give the keynote address at the beginning of this Buddhist conference. And he says, "I urge all overseas Chinese to unite unanimously to resist communism." So that was sort of the Cold War, that's characteristic really of the Cold War exchanges that were happening. But then he also adds, "and restore the Chinese nation." And that's why it's important that they were looking for so-called Chinese Buddhists to bring them home, to get them to support their motherland, Taiwan, in order to oppose the mainland, the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party claiming any legitimacy or any authority to represent China and Chinese civilization. Okay, so, and the interesting thing, what interests me here is, I should also say that this quote comes from a speech that the local Taiwanese newspaper referred to as a call to overseas Chinese Buddhists to join the holy war against communism. So again, you see this kind of conflation of politics and religion. But what interests me here also is that the mission of the World Chinese Buddhist Sangha Council and the KMT government was really complicated throughout these decades, and in this case in particular, because they didn't really take into account that many of the participants, the international participants, had their own agendas. So this is where we go back to that idea of stakeholders and the interests of individual stakeholders. And many of those agendas relate to local concerns, domestic politics, rather than what the ROC was interested in promoting. And so this is where we get to the first body that I want to talk about. And that is the body of, well, actually, before I do that, let's look at this quote. So this is when this monk here, the Vietnamese monk, was asked about what he envisioned the World Chinese Buddhist Sangha Council to be doing. He said, "Oh, I hope that Chinese Buddhists will establish an official body to organize and lead the world's Mahayanists," so as opposed to the Theravadan Buddhists of Ceylon, just as Theravadins have done in Ceylon. So he really imagined that this organization was going to support him in his local disputes, regardless of whether it had to do with communism or to do with China and mainland or People's Republic of China and the ROC. And what he had in mind, this is really underscored, this vision that he had is underscored by the first body that I want to talk about, and that is the body of this monk who self-immolated. And many people think he self-immolated because this image was used widely in the West to represent the Buddhist protest of the Vietnam War, the American Vietnam War. But in fact, what he was doing, and this other monk, Thich Tam Chau, was part of the organization of this protest. What he was protesting was the unfair treatment of Buddhists in South Vietnam by what they understood to be a Catholic government supported by the US. So there were policies in place that were hangovers really from the French colonization of Vietnam, but they were unfair to basically all religions except for Catholicism. I can go into more detail later about that if you want. But so this was a very local concern and had nothing to do with the war with Ho Chi Minh in the north. And so at this conference in Taipei, the monk Thich Tam Trao, he gifted the relic of this monk's body. Relic in Buddhism just refers to when a person of quite high spiritual attainment is cremated, or in this case, burned by himself. There are sort of stone-like, small pebble-like calcifications that are left behind in the ashes. And they're often different colors, purple, and some of them are kind of glowing or bright in some way. Those are the relics of these highly attained spiritual practitioners. And so the relic of this monk, in fact, his heart relic is in the basement of a pagoda in Ho Chi Minh City even today, supposedly. But so this monk, Thich Tam Trao, he brought the relic to the conference and gifted it to Bai Sheng, the Taiwanese representative, and the KMT, just to underscore what he was there for, really. And it was entirely lost. Reading the diary of Bai Sheng, it was entirely lost on the Taiwanese side. And they were more interested in anti-communism and the promotion of the Republic of China. All right, so now let's go to the second body I want to discuss, and that is the gendered body of the modern Chinese woman. And this body is represented here by this is Cao Kaiyu, and Cao Kaiyu was a flight attendant on Taiwan's only commercial airline at the time. She was also the runner-up, and here we go, we get to the beauty pageant. She was also the runner-up in the 1962 Miss China beauty pageant, which was held in Taipei. And she was also the representative for the World Chinese Buddhist Congress in taking these gifts. You can see here a small statue of the Bodhisattva of Compassion, Guanyin, and also a curated record of the proceedings of the conference. She was the one who hand-delivered those gifts to the major figures who around Southeast Asia who had attended the conference in Taipei in 1965. The reason I say that there is a political and religious intersection here in the body of Cao Kaiyu is because if you look at how she's dressed, she's wearing a qipao, which is a traditional Chinese dress, but this traditional Chinese dress in the 1930s, here's Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the KMT, the Nationalist Party, and his wife, Song Meiling. And she's the first lady of the Republic of China. And in the 1930s, she had already started wearing this very modern version of the qipao. Sorry, my fingers are moving here. And the modern aspects of it, you can see, are the slit up the side here. Oh, sorry. The slit up the sides, this is a very modern innovation. The short arms here at the shoulder, modern innovation. Also the accessories, the handbag, the necklace, and the hairstyle, long hair up in a very modern sort of hair style. I don't know. Obviously, I don't know much about hair. So she is the sort of symbol of a modern woman, really, from the 1930s. And so you can see that Cao Kaiyu really emulates her, including with the high heels as a part of this whole ensemble. So this is a modern, the Republic of China's representation of the modern Chinese woman. And it's not only meant to demonstrate the modernity of the Republic of China and also its elegance, let's say. It's meant to oppose, over here on the bottom, you can see the national dress for women on the mainland. Or we could say also the nationalist dress, the national dress for the socialist women's liberation movement globally. And that's embodied here in the wife of Mao Zedong. Her name is, what's her name again? I forgot, Jiang Qing, right? And so no makeup, cropped hair, military uniform. Also, we see it in here in this propaganda poster of the 1960s that was promoting iron women, as they were called, encouraging women to join the industrial workforce. So you can also see in their dress, it's a far cry from what we see with Songmei. And then finally, this juxtaposition is underscored in this 1967 image from a public struggle session in which the wife of a high-ranking Chinese Communist Party leader is forced to wear a chi pao that's too small for her, pearl necklace made of ping pong balls. You can't see she's also forced to wear oversized white heels, high heels, and this kind of ridiculous, supposedly fashionable hat. And this is all done in order to demonstrate that these symbols that the ROC is using to represent the modern woman, from the mainland's perspective, from the communist perspective, these are symbols of bourgeois capitalist commodification, and they depoliticize the role of women in society that the Communist Party is trying to create. And I know I'm over time, so I'm just going to go to the last slide. And this one is the third body that I want to mention. I'll do this very briefly. And this is the body of that has been participating in Buddhist cultural diplomacy for millennia. That is the body of Buddha. And again, as relic. And you can see here in this 1880s image from Sri Lanka, this is a procession of the Buddha tooth relic inside a casket in a sedan chair on top of an elephant. And so this is the sort of procession that these relics would sort of participate in. And the reason I bring this up is because the year after Cao Kai-u, the beauty contestant runner-up, went around Southeast Asia representing the Chinese Sangha Council and giving gifts. One of the leading monks, again from Taiwan, Bai Sheng, he gifted a Buddha relic, a relic of Buddha, to the Vietnamese of the South Vietnamese Buddhists. And here's me as a young man with my solemn face, which the photographer told me I had to make, holding a relic. So this is a reliquary, and the little tiny relic would be inside. This is one of a famous Chinese Buddhist monk called Empty Cloud, or Xu in Chinese. And so this little reliquary would be inside the casket, inside on top of this sedan chair, on top of the elephant. And the reason I feel that this is one of the third body of intersection between politics and religion in this case study is because, according to Bai Sheng, who would have been in a car following behind the elephant alongside this other Vietnamese monk, and by the way, the elephant would be on a flatbed truck by the 1960s, which would be decorated with flowers to make it into a float. According to Bai Sheng's diary, this reliquary started to fall off of the elephant because it wasn't attached tightly enough. So somebody quickly jumped and grabbed this tower, this small reliquary, and brought it to the car behind the elephant where the monks were, and they carried it for the rest of the trip. But the point that I want to make here is that in the diary, Bai Sheng says, because the sedan chair wasn't brought back up to the right position, it looked terrible. So he really considered asking the float driver to get out of the procession. He was ruining the aesthetic. But the reason he didn't is here, because the float had the flag of the Republic of China on the front of it. And so Bai Sheng thought, oh, the overseas Chinese adults beam and youth cheer nonstop when they see the national flag. So in other words, he had the national interest in mind, even in this moment, the solemn moment of procession with the Buddha relic. And just to finish off, the Vietnamese in the car, the Vietnamese monks listening to him sort of go over this in his mind and sort of say it out loud about the flag, they responded from their perspective saying, this isn't really about nations and flags and politics. This is about the Chinese Buddhist organization, the leader of the organization, you, Bai Sheng, gifting us, the Vietnamese. So it's a collaboration. It's a community of Buddhists. Why are you talking about flags? And so that, again, just demonstrates that kind of tension between the stakeholders' interests in all of these events. And that's it. Thank you for being compassionate enough to let me. Yes, good for you.
Well, thank you so much, Todd. And it's usually the sign of a person who's very enthusiastic about their area of study when they go over without even realizing it. So that's wonderful. So the first question that I wanted to ask you was to tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this subject, when did you go to China for the first time? How did you learn Chinese? Tell us a little bit about your own personal journey.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. And it's something that some of you have heard before. And that is, when I was living in Canada in my youth, in high school, I became interested in Asian religions in general. And so I used to skip high school classes and go to the downtown Vancouver library and read all about different Asian religions. And I came across a book written by D.T. Suzuki, who's a Japanese Buddhist and intellectual from the late 1800s, early 1900s, who explained Buddhism in a way that made sense to me. And that is in a very modern way, without much to do with ritual and without much talk about relics and these sorts of things. So I became interested in Buddhism. And eventually I went to Taiwan after graduating university, and I encountered an entirely different form of Buddhism. I all of a sudden saw the ritual, the communal activities, the relics, talk about flying bodhisattvas and things like that. And I just was struck by the contrast between what D.T. Suzuki was writing about and presenting to an English-speaking audience and a Western audience, and what I saw in Taiwan. And so that really sparked my interest in kind of being curious about what I, at the time, thought was the non-Buddhist aspects of Buddhism. In other words, the political, the commercial, the intersection with commerce, the intersection with diplomacy, migration, those sorts of things. And so that's really where my interest in all of this began.
And you learned Chinese in university before going, or you learned it on the ground?
I graduated with an undergraduate degree in evolutionary biology and a minor in Spanish literature. So nothing to do with anything of this. But then when I went there to Taiwan, I went to Taiwan, and I was invited to live in a monastery. And at first I was sort of not sure if I wanted to do it, because it seemed so foreign to me, to the kind of Buddhism that I had been studying, which had really been framed by the colonial understanding of Buddhism and then represented for the Western audience. But anyway, I ended up living in the monastery for almost 5 years. And they forced me to learn Chinese. They said, if you're going to stay here, you can't understand Buddhism or even understand us unless you learn Chinese. So that's why I learned Chinese. And then I'm happy that they forced me. I mean, it's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah. And how difficult was that?
Oh, I mean, I don't really know, because, people have often asked me, how long did it take? I don't really know. I just was doing it, and I lived there for 17 years. And at some point in those 17 years, I started understanding what people were saying and what I was reading on the billboards and things like that. Yeah.
Great. So one of the things that I think Westerners associate with Buddhism is harmony and peacefulness, and maybe even us withdrawing from worldly life, especially Buddhist monks. Mm-hmm. So can you explain for us a little bit about this Buddhist monk that you were speaking about, by showing his fervent interest in politics, his involvement in politics, and even what the connection could be between the practice of Buddhism and even war and violence?
Mm-hmm. I can say the easiest answer to that is that Buddhism and kingship developed alongside each other very closely from the beginning, from the association between Buddha and the kings of the northern Indian kingdoms as he was developing his ideas, and their patronage and their support. And then moving forward to 3rd century BCE, King Ashoka, which some people are familiar with, again, a great patron of Buddhism and supporter of Buddhism. But so alongside with Buddhism and kingship and that really tight relationship is the understanding that a good Buddhist king or a good Buddhist ruler is one who's not only a patron of Buddhism, but also a protector of Buddhism. And so to me, that's where a lot of these monks, all through history, for example, in the Empire of Bagan, which is now Myanmar, in the 7th century CE, we see monks cooperating with the kings of that empire to either destroy threats from minorities within the empire, other religions, or we see them collaborating with these protective Buddhist kings in resistance to neighboring states who are trying to invade. So already by that time, and then coming forward, 8th century Japan, the Heian period, we actually have warrior monks who are commissioned with carrying weapons and commissioned with protecting monasteries from adversaries, other Buddhist sects. And then in the 18th century, we have Chinese Buddhist monks engaging and being enlisted in the military to fight the Japanese, to resist Japanese invasion. Again, being understood as protecting Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, protecting the nation and its association with Buddhism. So I think that really helps to explain, especially this Taiwanese monk's understanding of his role during the Cold War period.
So you're a defender, not an attacker.
Right.
It's okay if you're a defender.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, the Dalai Lama has spoken a little bit about this as well, because in Tibet, when Tibet was trying to resist the communist expansion into their territory, there was a lot of violence. There was self-immolation, which is another form of violence, as we saw here. And the Dalai Lama talked about it from the perspective of intention. So if the intention of the violence is, again, going to something like protecting Buddhism or protecting people who are being bullied or something like that, then there's sort of, you can look for maybe a textual, a scriptural defense of that. Then the last thing I'll just say is, in Taiwan, for example, they have conscription, particularly because of the threat of the mainland Chinese. And as that grows, so for example, at one point, young men between 19 and 36 had to go into military service for 4 months. And as the threat from the mainland has increased recently, starting 2017, I think, they changed it to a year of service. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it doesn't matter if you're a monk or not. You still have to serve. And so you take your robes off. I mean, you put on other clothes, but then you put on the military uniform, and then you go in the military for a year, serve, and then you come back and you can then reordain. So when I was living in the monastery, many of my monk friends would go away and come back a year later, and they had been in the military.
Yeah, so it's not a contradiction in terms, part of the tradition.
It's part of, and also, I mean, you don't have to, you have the haircut already, so it's convenient.
The beauty pageant winner was a fascinating part of this talk. And I think one of the points that you were making was that Buddhism was being used, it was being instrumentalized in a way to say that Taiwan was the keeper of an important cultural tradition. And in that way, it was it justified its existence. Mm-hmm. But with the beauty pageant winner, or she was the runner-up, actually.
Right.
Yes. So she was a fitting ambassador because she was Buddhist.
Right.
But also, she was this beauty pageant winner in 1962, and my extensive research for this conversation showed that the Miss China pageant only started in 1960.
That's right. So
it seemed like that was also very intentionally a nod to Western traditions and to the U.S. in particular.
Yeah. So interestingly, actually, 1959 there was a Miss ROC trade fair. So the whole notion of it actually, interestingly, developed alongside the idea of development, of industrialization. But then it changed to be Miss China, which you can imagine that that's also a political move to claim the name of China, right? That you're representing China, and it's not the mainland who's representing China. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Miss Universe, the first Miss Universe pageant, and I'm not a historian of beauty pageants, but I think it was maybe 1951 in the UK in London, and then 1952 the US was Miss World was one of them, and Miss Universe was another one, but early 50s. Yeah. So this was definitely a modern Western innovation, right? Forward-looking innovation. And also, interestingly, Cao Kaiwu represented she also represented the elite families of the Nationalist Party, who had a strong tie to the mainland, to Chinese civilization, as opposed to many of the people who were already living. There were already Chinese people living on Taiwan, and also what they call Aboriginal people. And so she was she represented that elite class, actually, that was more tied to Chinese civilization than any of the local people would have been. So I have no idea if I've oh, right. And so, yes, this is definitely sort of an imitation of the West to demonstrate the modernization and the capacity of the Republic of China to act like a modern Western nation. Unlike
communist China.
Right, unlike the communist China, which you saw the representations of the modern woman there, wouldn't be winning any beauty pageants in the sense of the 1960s. What was the image of a beauty pageant winner? But I just want to add that it also, very importantly, and some people miss this point, is that the Republic of China was under military law until the 1980s. So it was an authoritarian single-party state. So it also had to work very hard to soften that image on the global stage. And so that this beauty pageant, and from the 1960s onwards, then overseas Chinese beauty pageants started to become a popular event. And so that was all part of, and also Cao Kaiwu, her image, and Song Meiling, her image as well, on the global stage, was helpful in softening this authoritarian regime that was actually known for what they call the White Terror, right? So it was a military regime, really.
One more question?
Yeah, so with an eye to allowing time for everybody else to ask questions as well, I'm going to skip down to the million-dollar question, asking you to predict the future. So our topic is Cold War era, and we seem to have entered a new Cold War era. The news lately seems to be telling us that we are in one and have been in one for a little while. And especially in light of Trump's extraction of Venezuela's president, and in light of his the designs on Greenland that he's been repeating, would you care to predict whether you think that China will use this moment to make a move to take back Taiwan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak from my experience in the last year and a half religiously reading the People's Daily, which is a mouthpiece newspaper for the Chinese Communist Party, published in Beijing. And interestingly, in the last little while, I've started to notice article after article kind of being constructed around the idea of cooperation and mutual benefit. And as China representing the possibility of living in this world without thinking of it as a zero-sum game. So I get the sense, I mean, previously, before reading these articles and paying attention to the People's Daily, which is a form of propaganda, but it gives you a sense of what the political party is thinking. I had the sense that they would take this advantage to take Taiwan. But now my sense is that actually the leaders of the Communist Party are smarter than I had given them credit. Oh, this is going on YouTube, right? I gotta be careful. In that they actually are starting to feel out what their role is in this new sort of Cold War or bifurcated political world. And that is the role of sort of the embracer and offering the potential to African nations and different places who need support to cooperate in a way that benefits the parties involved mutually, rather in opposition to what Donald Trump is presenting, which is more of the Cold War kind of bluster. So that's my take on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To a broader conversation with those in the room and those on Zoom, if there's questions. So I see Paul Brownback. Go ahead.
Hey, Todd, thanks. That was a great talk. I wonder, just following up on Megan's really great question, if you would imagine that when the Chinese Communist Party is sort of presenting themselves as the non-Trump approach, the people who, the group that's not going to steal presidents from their homes.
Mhm.
So as they're presenting themselves in this way, would it be useful for them, or do you imagine they might invoke Buddhism? They might say, look, we are actually the natural home of this peaceful religion.
Yeah.
Would they, instrumentalize Buddhism in this way?
That's a good question. I mean, they definitely have taken their foot off the gas on their surveillance of Buddhists in the last 5 years. And they have also, in the last 5 years, probably maybe a bit longer, have started to use Confucianism to represent the cultural heritage of the Chinese. And they've embraced it as a representation of that cultural heritage, when just over 30, so in the 1960s, they were leading the destruction of Confucianism and anything related to it. So yeah, I mean, I think this iteration of the Communist Party, and that's the way to think about it, is really that there have been all different iterations of the party, and this iteration seems to have a sense that they are now in a position that they can present themselves as a viable option to a world that wants stability. And that can be through language learning, through Confucian institutes, the spread of culture. And so Buddhism, I don't think, has taken a central position in that drive yet, but it may going forward, because Buddhism, one thing I can say, that the government has been very receptive to Buddhist monasteries developing and then using them as kind of cultural tourism, as sites of cultural tourism. And so that's maybe a first step in what you're talking about.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Gary.
Thanks, that was brilliant, thank you. I was really struck by the role of misinterpretation and misperception in the narrative you gave between the Taiwanese and the Vietnamese. And because it seems interesting to me that the whole Vietnam conflict itself involved very high level, severe misinterpretation amongst, from McNamara's on record about this now. So do you see that kind of cultural misinterpretation of the other stakeholders' motivations as itself a force of political transformation? Like, is it an essential part of these dynamics?
Yeah, like a dialectic kind of.
Yeah, this the misinterpreting of what they're actually interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of it, but I would say, I don't know if I would categorize what was going on here between the Vietnamese and the Taiwanese as misinterpretation. I think it was just two sides with their own interests, and one side using their leverage to promote those interests over the interests of the other side. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and I should just say that this, like Thich Tam Trao, the Vietnamese monk, and Bai Sheng, they had to communicate through an interpreter, right? So Thich Tam Trao did not understand or read Chinese, and Bai Sheng didn't speak or read Vietnamese. So there was lots of room for misinterpretation. But reading Bai Sheng's diary, he talks about Thich Tam Trao telling him what he wants. And even in that quote that I gave, it's very clear what he wants and what's important to him. But I think the Taiwanese side just felt like, if we can solve the bigger problem, which is our problem, your problem will probably resolve itself.
Yeah, we have a question on Zoom.
Jessica asks, I'm curious about the idea that the ROC wanted to display its modernness, and guess that by virtue of being communist, the People's Republic certainly wasn't anti-modern. Can you say more about how there were different visions of what it means or meant to be modern?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that image, this image here, really demonstrates the different ideas of what it means to be modern, because really this image here is what the PRC imagined the modern world to look like. Industrialization, especially to Chairman Mao, he was obsessed with industrialization as a kind of indicator of how well the communist state was doing compared to, like, that's the whole great leap forward in the 1950s was developed out of his obsession with catching up to Britain in its steel manufacturing and steel use. So I think this is a clear image of what definitely the 60s, and maybe even, I mean, it doesn't really change this Chinese communist image of what the modern is, it doesn't really change until the mid 1970s. 1976, Mao Zedong passes away. I always say to my Chinese wife that 2 years after I was born, he just couldn't handle being in the world with me, so he moved on. So I want to take some credit for that. And then 1978, Deng Xiaoping opens China up to the world. He visits Texas. He does all of these things where he changes the perception of what the vision of modernity means for the communist state. But that leads to some problems because it kind of gets out of control. And by 1989, Tiananmen Square, the state has to restrict what the possibilities are once again for what it means to be modern. So yeah, and again, of course, because like you can see in this struggle session image, I mean, this was the wife of Liu Shaoqi, who was the head of the People's Republic of China. After the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong took a sort of a back seat, and he remained the head of the Communist Party. But Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping became really the leaders of the state, of the PRC, and this is his wife. And so you can just see how she's being treated about a decade later, and to demonstrate how the communist state thought about the Western imperialist capitalist symbols of modernity. You can see how they're being used here to embarrass her.
Francis.
Yeah, so that was it during the Cultural Revolution.
This image?
Yeah.
1967.
Yeah.
Because it can give you a little bit more background. She went on a state visit in 1962, I think, 61, to Indonesia with her husband, then the leader of the People's Republic of China. They met Sukarno, and she actually wore almost identical clothing to what she's wearing in this struggle session. They forced her to wear the same clothing, a qipao, white high heels, this hat the qipao she had made in Shanghai, the hat she had made in Hong Kong, the pearls, this image of, like you see with, you see on the other side with the representatives of the Republic of China. And so this struggle session is bringing up that event and saying, you've crossed the line here. You shouldn't be dressing like this. You're supposed to be representing the People's Republic of China, and you're dressed like this to go on a state visit to Southeast Asia. So actually that white scarf around around her neck, at one point was also tied around her head to sort of represent a hijab, to also call back this moment of visiting Indonesia, a Muslim nation.
Todd, I wonder if you could just let people know what a struggle session is.
Oh, sorry, yeah, good point. So the Red Guard, the youth paramilitary that Mao Zedong was guiding in his speeches and through his actions, they were sort of enlisted to go around the country because, like I said, Mao Zedong had taken a back seat after the Great Leap Forward. So early 60s, he had sort of taken a back seat from making government policies because the Great Leap Forward policies were so horrible. And so during that period, actually, the People's Republic of China started to open up a little bit. They started to reintroduce private ownership of some land. They started to introduce the idea of overtime in factories. So when Mao Zedong was trying to gain back his power as the leader of the People's Republic of China by 1963, 1964, he did it by calling out those leaders during the period when he was taking a back seat as being what he called capitalist roaders, people who were following the capitalist road, people who he also called them counter-revolutionaries, people who were going against the values of the revolution, the socialist revolution. And so by the 1960s, 1966, the Cultural Revolution really started with Mao Zedong motivating the young Red Guard to go out and find these people who had gone against the values of the socialist revolution and take them into public spaces and make them confess their sins against the revolution. And so that's why she's in this public space. And in some cases, these people were beaten to death. Or in her case, jailed right afterward as being an enemy of the people, an enemy of the socialist state, because of their class background, because of the clothes they wore, because of their activities in capitalism, that sort of thing.
Yeah, Peter.
Todd, as thinking about the Cold War and how much of the Cold War for the West had a religious overtone or Christian overtone, and with England as well. Then some of the religious tones that you've talked about here and the non-religious part of the PRC, but you say that there's Buddhism or Confucianism going on within China. How did that affect how the West chose who to support? Or did it? You've hit on the Roman Catholic side. That was even easy for some of the Roman Catholics in the States.
Right. I mean, by 1949, Truman had made it clear publicly that the central aim of the U.S. foreign policy was to stop the red tide, right? Was to resist the spread of communism. So that drove a lot of the foreign policy going forward, especially then, like I said, in the 50s, early 50s, 53, when the northern part of the Korean Peninsula was controlled by the communists. And so I think that was more a driving the decisions about who to support and who not to support than religion was. But interestingly, I should say that I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned the World Fellowship of Buddhists that was established in 1950 in Sri Lanka, Ceylon. The CIA in the 1960s decided, or mid-50s actually, 1950s, they decided to infiltrate the World Fellowship of Buddhists and use it as cultural diplomacy in the fight against communism in Southeast Asia. And so they were actually funding through something called the Asia Foundation. If you look up the Asia Foundation, it was sort of this extension of supported by the CIA. It was the cultural extension, and it was involved with this Sri Lanka Theravadan Buddhist organization and funding their activities. And a lot of their activities had a little bit of anti-communist propaganda as part of spreading Buddhism and peace and love and all that stuff.
Thanks.
Scott, do we have another online?
Yes, Tamara, do you see a bit of a crossover with the established K-pop industry of South Korea, selling the notion of a questionable democracy through modern ideas of beauty and the right kind of Korea versus North Korea? It seems to line up with the use of beauty pageants and pop culture ways of promoting ideologies, fandoms replacing religious fervor in this case. Keeping in mind that BTS, the biggest K-pop group in the world, just very publicly took time off to serve in the military.
Yeah, interesting point. And I think there are lots of parallels. I must admit, I'm not a big K-popper or whatever, if that's a thing. I'm more of a Mandarin pop. But yeah, there are a lot of parallels, and also not only with what's happening in Korea, but also what's continuing to happen in Taiwan, but even more so now with the People's Republic of China and their efforts to soften their image. So the idea of this kind of soft diplomacy is definitely being adopted. And I should just point out, for Megan's sake here, that in the 1970s, the Soviet Union started to encourage Mongolian Buddhists to represent them in order to help soften the image of the Soviet Union globally in the Cold War era. So there is a precedent for all of this sort of intersection between politics and religion, definitely during the Cold War period and in the present.
Great. Well, on that note, I think we say thank you. Your attention to next week's lecture with Bushra Mossman on North of Ordinary Muslim Lives in the Canadian Arctic. So join us to hear about the Muslim lives in the Arctic. See you next week, same time, same place. Thanks, everybody.